The World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, has traditionally been the playground of the liberal international order. It is a place where European bureaucrats, climate activists, and global banking elites gather to discuss a world that, for the most part, excludes the chaotic realities of hard power. But this year, something fundamental changed in the Swiss Alps. While the cameras were focused on public speeches and climate pledges, the real story, the history-changing story, was happening behind closed doors in private suites and heavily guarded hotel wings. For the first time in years, the United States did not send a delegation to lecture Russia on morality. Instead, President Donald Trump sent his most trusted inner circle, Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff, to engage directly with Vladimir Putin's representatives. This was not a standard diplomatic mission. It was a high-stakes business negotiation disguised as statecraft. The title of this episode is simple, but the implications are massive. We are looking at why Trump's team met with Putin in Davos. And to understand this, you have to look past the headlines and understand the mechanics of the deal that is currently reshaping the global map. To understand why this meeting happened now, we must first look at the timeline. We are in January 2026. The war in Ukraine has ground on for nearly 4 years. The front lines are frozen. The European economy is fracturing under the weight of energy costs and industrial decline. And in Washington, the Trump administration has decided that the return on investment for this war is no longer positive. The America First doctrine does not deal in endless ideological struggles. It deals in leverage and exits. The meeting in Davos was not about friendship. It was about liquidation, closing a failed venture to free up capital for the next big acquisition. The choice of envoys tells you everything you need to know about Trump's strategy. He did not send the Secretary of State. He did not send a career diplomat from the Foreign Service who spent 30 years studying Soviet history. He sent Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. Who are these men in this context? They are real estate tycoons. They are deal makers. Witkoff is a man who understands distressed assets. He understands how to look at a broken property, in this case, a broken security architecture in Europe, and figure out the price to fix it. Jared Kushner is the architect of the Abraham Accords, a man who bypassed traditional diplomatic channels to redraw the Middle East. Sending them to meet Putin's proxies in Davos and subsequently to Moscow was a signal to the Kremlin. We are not here to discuss the UN Charter. We are here to cut a deal. The narrative being fed to the public is that this meeting was about peace. And while peace may be the byproduct, the motivation is power. You have to understand the pressure cooker that the United States is currently in. The dollar is facing threats from the BRICS alliance. The debt ceiling is a recurring nightmare. And the true strategic rival, China, has been watching the West bleed its military stockpiles into the mud of the Donbass for years. The Trump administration understands that every shell fired in Ukraine is a shell that cannot be fired in the Taiwan Strait. The meeting in Davos was the beginning of the pivot. It was an attempt to cauterize the wound in Europe so the U.S. can turn its full attention to the Pacific. So, what actually happened in Davos? While President Trump was publicly meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, a meeting that was reportedly tense and transactional, his envoys were opening the back channel with Russia. Reports indicate that Witkoff and Kushner met with Kirill Dmitriev, the head of Russia's sovereign wealth fund, and a key Putin confidant who has served as a bridge to the West in the past. This is classic Track 2 diplomacy. While the presidents shake hands for the cameras, the money men sit in a quiet room and discuss the real terms: sanctions relief, territorial lines, and security guarantees. This brings us to the core of the negotiation. Why would Putin agree to meet? Why would Russia, which feels it is winning on the battlefield, entertain a delegation from Washington? The answer lies in the Russian economy. Despite the bravado from Moscow, the war has been incredibly expensive. Russia has survived sanctions, yes, but it has mortgaged its future to China. Putin is a strategist. He knows that becoming a vassal state of Beijing is a long-term threat to Russian sovereignty. A deal with Trump, a deal that freezes the conflict and perhaps lifts the most crippling financial sanctions, gives Moscow a way out of Beijing's grip. It allows Russia to rebalance. Trump knows this. He is offering Putin a lifeline, not out of charity, but to drive a wedge between Russia and China. This is the reverse Kissinger strategy. In the 1970s, Nixon and Kissinger went to China to isolate the Soviet Union. In 2026, Trump's team went to Davos to neutralize Russia to isolate China. But there is a darker, more urgent aspect to this meeting that we must analyze. The situation on the ground in Ukraine has reached a critical breaking point. The territorial issue mentioned in the leaks from these meetings refers to the land Russia currently occupies. For years, the Western position was nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine, and total restoration of 1991 borders. The presence of Kushner and Witkoff suggests that this policy is dead. Real estate developers do not talk about moral victories. They talk about zoning. They are likely looking at the map of Ukraine not as a sovereign nation to be saved, but as a partition plan to be managed. The discussions in Davos likely revolved around where the new Iron Curtain will fall. Will it be the Dnieper River? Will it be the current line of contact? And most importantly, what security guarantees will the remaining part of Ukraine get? This is where the risk factor skyrockets. The Europeans, the Germans, the French, the British, are watching this Davos channel with absolute terror. For decades, European security was guaranteed by Washington. If Trump's envoys cut a separate peace with Putin, Europe is left alone on the continent with a rearmed and combat-tested Russia. This explains the frantic diplomatic activity we saw in Davos from European leaders trying to get into the room. They realize that if the US and Russia make a deal over their heads, the European Union becomes a spectator in its own backyard. The silence from the EU leadership after these meetings is deafening. It is the silence of panic. Let's go deeper into the specific role of Steve Witkoff. Why him? Witkoff is Trump's special envoy for the Middle East, yet he is leading talks on Russia. This is a crucial detail that mainstream analysis often misses. It suggests that the Trump administration views the Ukraine war and the Middle East conflict as linked theaters. They are looking for a grand bargain. Perhaps the deal involves Russia pulling back support for Iran's proxies in the Middle East in exchange for concessions in Eastern Europe. Perhaps it involves energy markets, stabilizing oil prices to lower inflation in the US, which requires Russian cooperation. By sending the same man who negotiates with Saudi Arabia and Israel to negotiate with Putin, Trump is signaling that these are not separate wars. It is one global chessboard, and he is trying to arrange the pieces for a checkmate that secures American economic dominance. We must also talk about the atmosphere of the meeting itself. Sources describe the talks as frank and constructive. In diplomatic language, frank usually means there was shouting, or at least very hard truths were exchanged. Constructive means they didn't walk out. The fact that this meeting moved from a hotel suite in Davos to a direct flight to Moscow for a 4-hour sit-down with Putin himself proves that the framework of a deal is already in place. Dictators like Putin do not meet with envoys for 4 hours to brainstorm. They meet to finalize. They meet to look the representative in the eye and see if the American president can actually deliver on his promises, or if the deep state in Washington will sabotage the deal. This brings us to the internal power struggle in the United States. We know there are elements within the CIA, the Pentagon, and the State Department who view Russia as an eternal enemy. They believe that any concession to Putin is a betrayal of the post-World War II order. By using Kushner and Witkoff, family and business associates, Trump is bypassing his own bureaucracy. He is running a privatized foreign policy. This is dangerous, but it is also efficient. It prevents leaks, and it prevents the sabotage that plagued his first term. However, it raises a massive question of accountability. Who are these envoys accountable to? The American voter? The Senate? Or just the president? In Davos, they were operating with the full authority of the White House, but without the oversight of the American people. Let's pause and look at the Board of Peace initiative that Trump launched at Davos. On the surface, it sounds like a hollow slogan, but combined with these meetings, it functions as a new institutional wrapper for this deal. If the UN Security Council is paralyzed because Russia and the US both have veto power, Trump is creating a new table, a board of directors for the world, where the shareholders with the most military and economic stock get to decide the rules. This is a move away from the one country, one vote system of the UN toward a great power concert. It is a return to 19th century diplomacy. If you are a small nation like Ukraine or the Baltic states, this is a terrifying development. It means your fate is being decided in a room you are not even invited to. The economic angle of the Davos meeting cannot be overstated. We saw Josh Gruenbaum, an economic advisor, joining the team. This confirms that sanctions were on the table. The weaponization of the US dollar, freezing Russian central bank assets, scared the entire global South. It accelerated the move toward alternative currencies. Trump, who is a businessman, understands that if the dollar loses its status as the global reserve currency, American power collapses. He likely views the sanctions on Russia as a diminishing asset. They didn't stop the war, but they are hurting the dollar's reputation. The offer in Davos likely included a roadmap for reintegrating Russia into the SWIFT system or unfreezing assets in exchange for ending the hot war. This is the carrot. The stick is the threat of unleashing full American energy production to crash the price of oil, which would bankrupt the Kremlin. What is the immediate next step? We are hearing about a trilateral meeting in Abu Dhabi. This location is significant. The UAE has maintained good relations with both Moscow and Washington. It is neutral ground. If Davos was the opening pitch and Moscow was the negotiation, Abu Dhabi is where the lawyers draft the contract. We should expect to see a ceasefire proposal that looks very different from what Zelensky wanted. It will likely involve a demilitarized zone, international peacekeepers, perhaps from non-NATO countries, and a tacit acceptance that Crimea and the Donbass are gone for now. But here is the catch: the sell. How does Trump sell this to the American public and the world? He will frame it as stopping the killing. He will claim he saved the world from World War III. He will say he saved the U.S. taxpayers billions of dollars. And to a war-weary public, that message will likely land effectively. But for the geopolitical analyst, the cost is clear. It validates the use of force to change borders. It tells every dictator with an army that if you can hold territory long enough and bleed the West expensive enough, you will eventually get a meeting in Davos and a deal in Moscow. We must also consider the role of Zelensky in this Davos drama. He arrived in Switzerland seeking money and weapons. He left with a meeting schedule he didn't control. The body language in Davos was telling. The era of the blank check is over. The pressure on Kyiv to accept a bad deal is now immense. The U.S. strategy has shifted from as long as it takes to take what you can get. The danger for Ukraine now is internal collapse. If Zelensky agrees to cede territory, he faces a nationalist uprising at home. If he refuses, he faces a total cutoff of American aid. Kushner and Witkoff likely delivered this ultimatum in the politest, most constructive terms possible. The implications for the UK are also profound. Britain has been the most hawkish supporter of Ukraine. With the US pivoting to a deal, the UK is left exposed. They cannot fund the war alone. The Davos meeting effectively neutered British foreign policy. We may see a sudden shift in London's rhetoric in the coming weeks as they scramble to align with the new reality coming out of Washington. The special relationship is being tested because Trump is prioritizing the great power relationship with rivals over the traditional alliances with friends. As we look at the conclusion of this event, we have to ask, who benefits? Putin benefits because he survives and keeps territory. Trump benefits because he claims a foreign policy win and pivots to China. China loses a vassal, but gains time while the US is distracted with the cleanup. Europe loses its security blanket. Ukraine loses land, but gains survival. This is the cold calculus of the Davos meeting. It was not a meeting of minds. It was a liquidation of a failed investment. The Davos man, the globalist ideal of a world without borders and without war, died in that hotel suite. In its place, the realist man returned. The world is back to spheres of influence, back to secret treaties, and back to the idea that might makes right, as long as the price is right. We are entering a period of immense volatility. The deal discussed in Davos and Moscow is fragile. A single rogue missile, a single assassination, or a breakdown in the Abu Dhabi talks could torch the entire framework. But for now, the channel is open. The phone line between the White House and the Kremlin, which had been cut for years, has been reconnected by two real estate developers in a Swiss ski resort.